Hello, my name is John Dillon, and we're here to talk about Salesforce Apex programming. Today, the topic is going to be on collections. This is our collection series part 3, and we'll be covering maps and the map object. So for starters, what is a map? It goes by different names depending on the different programming language or environment that you're in. Some call it a dictionary, some a hash map, some hash table. In Apex, it's simply called a map, and it is a way to link up one object to another, or to do a lookup more specifically, using an object as the key. When we looked at lists last time, we could look up any item in the list via a number based on the order it was put into the list. It's very similar with maps, except what you can use to do the lookup can be anything. It can be a string, it can be an account, it could be any kind of object. So that is actually very useful. They also have higher efficiency than list, which we'll talk about when we take a look. First, let's take a look at the API. As we've mentioned before, the Apex reference guide is probably the best place to look up information on anything when you've got a question about how an object or a class works. We will look at the constructors on the map. We won't jump into too much detail right now on the constructors. We'll get to that in a little bit. There are lots of methods. Of course, we're not going to go over every single one of them. That would take too long. The key ones that we are going to be looking at are put, get, key set, values, and contains key. Rather than talk about them, let's just look at an example. Again, we're going to be using anonymous Apex code. One thing that you'll notice is different is that with lists, we would describe the object the list was going to act on. With maps, we need to provide it two objects, one for the key, one for the value. In this case, we're going to do a map of string to string, but it could be anything. It could be string to opportunity, ID to account. We could even get really complicated by making a string to yet another map, but we're not going to go there today. So for this example, we're going to talk about meals. We might have a map in our day for what we might have for different meals. For breakfast, I'm having eggs. For lunch, I'm having a sandwich. And those are the types of things, those relationships are what maps are for, where we have one thing that points us directly to another. So here we are using the put method, and put is how we add something to a map. And we provide it with the key and then the value. So again, breakfast, eggs, lunch, sandwich, dinner, steak. So this is how we're choosing to store these. Again, a very simple example. We'll get into a more complicated one in a little bit. And then what we can use is the get method to pull things out of the map. And you always use get with the key. For instance, so we'll do a little system debug, get the breakfast, get the lunch, and get the dinner, and let's just see what happens when we do that. And we can see our values, eggs, sandwich, and steak. Now, another way that we can get the same information is if we were to loop through it. Now, we saw looping with lists, where you would just loop through and print out everything in the list. With maps, you typically loop over or iterate over the keys, and then you pull out the values. So that would look something like this. So notice we're using the key set method. The key set sounds like it returns a set, and it does. And that is the set of all the keys. So if we wanted to see what those are, we could simply print those out. And when we execute that, we get the keys, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Similarly, we can also get the values, which is simply the list of the values. And there we go. And to look at how we are going to use the get method in a loop, we're going to jump onto a more involved example. And we'll do this in some trigger code. So here we have a trigger handler on the opportunity. If you're not familiar with the trigger handler, you can either check out how it's described in the free mini course we've got listed in the description below. One of the basic things in any trigger code, when we're working through the objects that are being updated, we only have access to the data on that object. For instance, with an opportunity, when we're updating it, we have access to all the fields on the opportunity, including the account ID, which is its related account, but we don't have information on the account itself. For that, we have to do another query, which we could do by simply querying the list of accounts that are associated with these opportunities. We actually get some efficiencies, and it's a little easier to work with a map. We'll show that with an example. So the idea here is when we're updating an opportunity, we want to check the account and see how many employees that account has. If they fall into a certain range, we want to update the priority on the opportunity between low, medium, and high. Priority is a custom field that I've added to this opportunity, or to the opportunities in this instance. So you'll see that it's not something standard. And yes, we could do this with a formula field, but I think for illustrating the usefulness of a map, this is it's a good example without getting too complicated. So when we are in a trigger, we have access to all the data that the object itself has on it. In this case, we've got an opportunity. We're doing an opportunity trigger. So we have access to everything that's on the opportunity. But what we don't have access to is extended relationships. For instance, if I wanted to, I could look up the account ID because that's stored on the opportunity. But if I need the account's name or the account's number of employees, it's not going to be there for me. Let's take a look at an example. Let's loop through the opportunities and see what is available to us. So now that we've got this set in our trigger, we're going to be dumping out the opportunity account ID, but also we're going to attempt to grab the number of employees off of the account. And we can test that by simply making any change to any opportunity. So we'll just add a tracking number to this guy. And we can look at the logs. So we can see we've got the account ID on the opportunity, but account number of employees is null. Now, we know it's not null. It's simply not available in the trigger context. So the next thing we would like to do is query the accounts. So to do that, we'll have to add the account IDs that we get to the set that we created earlier. And that will allow us to query the accounts that we need. And rather than storing them in a list like we've done in the past, we're going to put them in a map. And here's where we get to the constructor we mentioned in the documentation. One of the constructors available is you can give it a record list, and that is a list of S objects. Now we know one way to generate a list of S objects is to do a SOQL query. So that's exactly what we can do. We can query the accounts and then rather than deal with them as a list, we store them in a map. And the key to the map is always going to be the ID, and then the value is going to be the object itself. And that's why we have our map set up as a map of IDs to accounts. We're going to do a similar loop to what we did previously, but now we are going to actually access the account from the map, and that should give us the data that we are looking for. So here's how we access it. We know we've got an opportunity has an account ID, and we know we created a map of accounts based on those IDs that we collected. So we simply take the map, do a get using the opportunity account ID as a lookup, and we will get the account object. Now, I should say it's a little safer to put a guard in here before we do any activities. The reason is, in this case, we're probably safe, but there might be some times, for instance, if we had some filter on this query, where the list of accounts we get back, the map of accounts we get back might be much smaller than the number of opportunities. So just to make sure we don't get any weird behavior, we'll check to make sure the map contains the key before we get it. Getting it wouldn't be a problem, but if this returns null and then we use null, we're gonna get a null error. So we could test this right now and see if we're actually getting the number of employees. Look in our logs. Yep, now we're getting number of employees. Now that we know we're getting the number of employees, we can make some decisions based on that. Okay, so the actions we're taking, if the number of employees is less than 5,000, we're going to call the opportunity a low priority. If they're between 5,000 and 20,000, then it's going to be medium, and anything else is going to be above 20,000 or 20,000 or greater. So that's going to be a high priority. But the important thing is when we did the account map lookup, we take the opportunity account ID, we get an account that has all the data that we queried for. Another thing to point out is if we had simply done the query without the map and used it as a list, to do this determination, we would have had to loop through that list every time for every opportunity to look for the account ID match. So maps are much more efficient than lists when you're looking up data, especially if you've got data in the hundreds or thousands. The time consumption of looping through a list could be significant enough that it could cause some timeout errors in your triggers. Let's test it out. And we knew this one had 120 employees because we saw that in the previous run. So it got low. Let's just add a few more. So we've got mostly lows and a medium. We can see that our trigger is working, and with the map, it helps us do it, helps us get the information that we normally couldn't, and to access it efficiently. Also, it's just convenient. It's a one-line account map.get, whereas with a list we would have to loop through it to find what we're looking for, or maybe spin that off into its own method. Well, I hope this has been helpful and you have a better understanding of maps and how to use them. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. If there are any Apex challenges that you are struggling with, feel free to reach out and I will cover that in a future video. If you're new to Apex, or even if you've been doing it for a while, please check out my mini course on Apex patterns and anti-patterns to show you best practices and common pitfalls to avoid when working with Apex. The link is below in the description, and I will see you next time.